tied his limbs to 4 horses, each facing a different corner of the square. The ropes were thick, soaked in blood from earlier tortures. The crowd pressed closer, silent but trembling. Then, the whip cracked. The animals reared, nostrils flaring, flesh stretched, a tendon snapped like a bowstring. Damiens screamed, his voice lost in the thunder of hooves. Paris had never seen anything like it. Robert-François Damiens, a servant, a dreamer, and a desperate man, had struck at the body of the king himself. On January 5th, 1757, outside Versailles, he lunged from the crowd and stabbed Louis XV in the ribs with a small penknife. The wound barely pierced the skin, but the gesture alone shook the monarchy to its core. To harm the king was to harm God's anointed. And in France, that meant one thing: a death so terrible it would erase the thought from every mind that dared imagine rebellion. They called him the Accursed, and his fate was sealed before the blade had even been cleaned. He was seized instantly. Courtiers beat him bloody before guards dragged him to Paris. His wife and daughter were imprisoned. His family name was ordered erased from all records. He was locked in the conciergerie, the same dungeon that would one day hold the condemned of the revolution. There, the torture began. Under the dim light of torches, his flesh was torn with red-hot pincers. They poured boiling oil, molten lead, and burning wax into his wounds. The smell of seared flesh filled the stone chamber. He confessed nothing. There was nothing to confess. Damiens had acted alone, a lone spark of rage in a kingdom of fear. For nearly 3 months, he waited in his cell, chained in darkness, while carpenters built the scaffold that would make history. The sentence, read aloud by the Parlement of Paris, was an echo from the Middle Ages. He shall be taken to the Place de Grève, his flesh torn with pincers, his right hand burned with sulfur, molten lead poured upon his wounds, and his body drawn and quartered by 4 horses until dead. On March 28, 1757, the city awoke to a cold, grey dawn. Church bells tolled. Soldiers lined the streets. From every quarter of Paris, people came, nobles in velvet cloaks, merchants, beggars, priests, and children perched on rooftops. They had come to see the king's vengeance. Damiens was led from his cell barefoot, wrapped in rags stiff with dried blood. His body trembled from fever. The priest who walked beside him said he whispered prayers through cracked lips, but his eyes were calm. The eyes of a man who had seen what cruelty meant. He was brought to the scaffold in the center of the square. The executioners, men hardened by years of killing, hesitated. They had practiced for weeks, rehearsing every motion, because no one alive had ever performed such an execution. The crowd pressed forward. The drums began to beat. First came the mutilation. They cut off his right hand, the hand that had held the knife, and threw it into a brazier of burning sulfur. The air filled with a choking hiss. Damiens howled as his skin blistered, and the smell of scorched flesh drifted through the air. The horses snorted, stamping impatiently on the stones. Then the 4 ropes were fastened, 1 to each limb. The animals strained, muscles coiling under their slick hides. A signal was given. Whips lashed, the horses bolted. The ropes pulled taut. Damiens's body twisted violently, limbs dislocating with sickening cracks. Blood sprayed the cobblestones. Still, he lived. The executioners tried again. They switched the horses, pulling harder, faster, in opposite directions. His torso began to tear apart at the joints. Witnesses said the sound was like cloth ripping underwater. Slow, wet, and endless. Damiens shrieked until his voice failed. His body convulsed, arching toward the sky as if trying to escape itself. The crowd wavered between horror and fascination. Some crossed themselves, others fainted. children were pulled away, but the horses could not finish it. The tendons were too strong, so the executioners took knives and cut deeper into the wounds, severing sinews by hand. Blood ran like rivers down the scaffold steps. Only then did the animals manage to pull him apart. First one arm, then another, then both legs, torn free from the body. A cloud of steam rose as the warmth of blood met the cold air. The remains of the man who had dared strike the king lay scattered in the mud. It was not over. His torso, what was left of it, was thrown into a roaring fire. The flames devoured him, hissing as fat dripped into the coals. The ashes were gathered and cast into the wind. Even his name was forbidden to be spoken. All that remained was the lesson. Defy the crown, and this is what awaits. Yet the horror did not silence France. It awakened something darker. The Enlightenment philosophers whispered of cruelty and tyranny. The people remembered the smell, the screams, the futility of the act, and when the time came, it was the king who would face the executioner's hand. Years later, when the guillotine rose over Paris, it was said that Damiens' spirit had returned, no longer the servant punished for rebellion, but the omen of a nation that would soon devour its rulers as mercilessly as he had been destroyed. Damiens' death marked the end of an age, the last medieval execution in France, the last time horses tore a man apart for the pleasure of kings. It was cruelty refined into ceremony, horror given legal sanction, a mirror held up to humanity's darkest impulse. Even now, historians argue whether the crowd cheered or wept. Perhaps both. But the question remains, who was truly punished that day? The man who died screaming, or the world that watched him suffer? If this story unsettled you, reflect on it. Justice, power, obedience. How easily they blur when fear rules the heart. Tell me what you think. And if you thought this was horrifying, wait until you hear about the man executed by elephant, the death of a Persian general. India, 4th century.